Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hilary Hunt, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Making Sense Project webinar. It is March 4th, and we're going to be kicking off here. So as we get started, for those of you who are familiar with our webinars, we're going to sort of follow a familiar format, give you a little bit of background on the Making Sense Project, talk about our main topic for the day, which is emergency savings, and then share some additional opportunities and links to the evaluation and Act 48 at the end. The Making Sense Project is a partnership between the Pennsylvania Department of Education and Penn State University. And I'm excited to have on the line with us Dr. Kevin Curry, who is our fantastic project partner from Penn State. And I see also joining us is our former retired professor that we worked with, Kathy Bowen. So welcome, Kathy, and thanks for all that you did to help get this project started. The Making Sense webinars are part of an overall program where we try and support financial education in mostly K-12 schools across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If you haven't been to our website at makingsensepa.org, I'd encourage you to do so and see what other resources we have available in addition to these webinars. The webinars, some of you have been on for many of these, some of these may be new to you, but we try and do a couple of different things depending on the session. So in some cases, we're focused entirely on content knowledge. In others, we're trying to do highlight different financial literacy resources, and in others, we're sharing professional information. And I would say that we're going to focus on the first two of those pillars, content knowledge and financial literacy resources in today's session. So I'm excited and glad that you're able to join us today. If you haven't had a chance yet, I would love it if you could go over and locate the chat function. We are back in the webinar style format. So one thing that I'd ask you to do is to share with panelists and attendees. That way everybody can see your introduction. Share where you're from, grade level that you teach. County is always very helpful for me when trying to locate where folks are. And if you'd like, share what it is that you do with financial education, if you have a course or a unit. And thank you for those that joined us a few minutes early for also letting me know the status of spring being on its way to you and your household or locations with crocus and daffodils blooming or budding, what have you, or just poking through. So with that, I encourage everybody to do a self-introduction and appreciate everybody doing so. So let's kick off with our topic for today, saving for emergencies, what we've learned and how we can apply it. So at this point, we are basically a year into this global pandemic. If there is one thing that I think that this entire situation has taught us in terms of finances, it's the importance of having saved for emergencies. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but also some general things about saving for emergencies in this session and the time that we have together. I put this webinar together, and I'm really hopeful that we're going to be able to get through all that I have to share with you in this hour. So I apologize in advance for trying to fly through a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. But I wanted to give you as many and as different kinds of resources as possible. So we're going to talk about a few different topics today, including different types of emergency that we save for. I'm going to be sharing some statistics and some data and some research on emergency savings and just savings rates in general. And then throughout the session, our time together, I'll be sharing with you a variety of different classroom resources that hopefully you can put into use with your students. Some of those are just going to be some simple strategies that I'm sharing with you, ideas that I have that hopefully you can take in and use in your classroom. And others that are sort of prepared, already out there, links and what have you from other resources. I am going to ask Dr. Kevin Curry, to share with you a link to a Google Doc. The Google Doc has a link to these slides, as well as all of the important links and the sort of the data sources and everything that I'm going to be sharing with you throughout the webinar. So if you want to grab that, open that in another window or what have you, or just wait and have it for later. That'll be there for you. But I'm pretty sure that everything that I'm going to be mentioned is listed there, and you don't have to take down too many notes or scribble too fast, at least not on the sources of things as we go along. So with that, let's dive in and talk about saving for the unexpected. So one of the resources that I'm sharing with you in that document is America Saves. And America Saves Week actually just happened the other week. And it is a time that is set aside to focus on savings. And so this graphic, as well as a few others that I'm going to share from are from America Saves. And I just thought I would point that out as just an additional resource that's focused on promoting and encouraging good savings behaviors for individuals of all ages and for a variety of different reasons. But when we talk about saving for the unexpected and to expect the unexpected is really kind of the whole gist of saving for emergencies, right? So I want to just talk a little bit about what kind of unexpected savings I think about when I think about saving for emergencies, and share with you some thoughts about sort of two buckets or categories or ways to think or approach this that are, I think, a little bit different, but sometimes get lumped in all at once altogether. So what I would like to ask you is a rainy day fund, those things that we refer to often, saving for a rainy day, the same as an emergency fund? So when you guys think of saving for an emergency, what is it that you think of? And I'd like to offer sort of two different ways to think about this, in which case these two would be different. And certainly you can call them different things, but I want to just make sure that we're thinking about sort of two distinct categories, if you will, of emergencies. So when we think about a rainy day fund, or when I reference a rainy day fund for the purpose of this webinar, I'm talking about unexpected expenses. So if we think about our traditional budget, right, you have your expenses and you have your income. And the way that I think about these emergencies and these saving for emergency kind of focus on those two different sides. So when I think about the rainy day fund, in my terminology, I'm talking about those things that are usually one-time expenditures that you just didn't anticipate, right? Or maybe you know that eventually you're going to have to pay for new tires, but you don't know when that's going to be. You don't, know when you're going to get a flat tire. You don't know, when these different types of things are going to happen, and you want to avoid having to go into debt to pay for these when they come up, right? So the rainy day fund, if you will, is intended in this case, or just the fund for unexpected expenses, if you want to be more specific, is just that. It's to cover those expenditures that you can't necessarily control the timing of what they're going to happen, or when it may, or when it might happen, or what it will be. Contrast that to sort of financial emergencies or an emergency savings fund, which is sort of that flip side of the coin. So if we were looking at the expense side, this one comes over more to the income side. And when we talk about that, we're talking about specifically the loss of income and the need for a safety net in the event that that happens. So things like somebody loses their job, or they have some type of an illness or injury that prevents them from working for a period of time, and they see maybe not a complete loss of income, but certainly a drop in income. And this in particular is the piece that really connects to what we've seen over the last year with the pandemic. So we have seen individuals in incredibly high numbers that have, in some cases, lost their job completely, in some cases had to, or made the hard decision to leave the workforce in order to deal with situations, say, for example, with children being at home. Those who have suffered a loss of income because their hours were cut, or they were completely terminated as a result of everything that has happened over the past year. Certainly, job loss and drops of income can happen at any point in time. We have just seen this magnified on a scale, many, many times over in the past year that has really, I think, brought this home for many individuals. And one point to point out, individuals with a single income, so say, for example, those who rely fully on one source of an income are, often at more of a risk. Those who own a home and are tied to that expense, maybe those who are self-employed, all of these can be, make this emergency savings fund even more important. So those are sort of the two categories, and we're going to be thinking about those in slightly different ways as we talk through this. But I just wanted to point out to you that not all emergency savings or rainy day savings is necessarily for the same purpose or for the same idea. And so we're going to come back to some things later in terms of how much emergency savings an individual should have. But this is sort of to sort of set the stage for you thinking about what that would be used for in particular. So I have a question for you. I'm gonna put a poll up here. Let me pull it up. I want to see, and we're going to see how many we think that we can come up with here. How many unique unexpected expenses do you think that we can come up with, or I should say that all of you should come up with, and I'm showing that we have about 25 people signed in right now. That'll give you an idea that we can come up with in terms of a unique unexpected expense, so the rainy day side of this, that we can come up with in 1 minute. So let me see what you guys think. How many do you think that we can come up with? How many do you think we can name? Don't anybody start anything in the chat, just answer the poll and let's see what you guys think. How many do you think we can come up with in 1 minute? I'm going to pull up my timer because in just a second we are going to do exactly that. All right, you guys are being pretty optimistic and I'm excited about that. So most of you are thinking that we can get, well, 70% of you think that we can get 31 to 50 different unique expenses. Nobody thinks we can get over 70. Okay, so on your mark, get set. In the chat, I want you to very quickly name as many different things that we would have as an unexpected expense as you can possibly think. And I'm going to be extra nice and give you some categories here that you might think about. Go. All right, timer has started. Oh, I like it. Dental filling, broken leg, gas line failure. Ooh, roof leak, lost luggage, hot water heater broke. Yes, how horrible is that one? Emergency room visit for a kid, new glasses, car accident, flat tire, furnace repair, cracked window, lost phone. Ooh, somebody give me a bunch of them at once. Good. Dog pet needs, ER care, water line broken, braces for your kid. Oh yeah, that one's a hard one. A pricey one. Appliances breakdown. Yes. Anybody else ever had their, washer or dryer stop or any of those others? Yes. A root canal. I have had that one happen before. Cell phone cracks. Yes. Great lesson from my son. Laptop stolen. Yes. I never forget a neighbor having that happen when I lived in an apartment. 14 seconds left. Water damage, physical therapy, electrical outage, loss of freezer food. Good one. Oh man, you guys are coming up with so many. Oh, the key fob. Yes, the key fob on your car. That is an expensive one. All right, time is up. I'm going to stop us. All right, Kevin, I'm going to ask you to try and go through there and recap and see how many you think that we came up with. If you don't mind, I would appreciate you scrolling through that chat and seeing how many you think we came up with. I think we came up with a lot. We'll see what that total was. So I've broken these down into a couple of categories that I think can be helpful. And I would encourage you, if you're doing this with students, to have them think and prompt them with some categories and see how many can they come up with. By the way, this is one of those strategies that I love if you're doing distance learning, is to ask them how many things you can come up with. Tell them they can't post in the chat until you say go. Sometimes it can help to give everybody like a minute or 2 or 5 to write a list and then share them. But it's just kind of fun. So I would encourage you to use that just as a strategy. So, oh, awesome. Kevin says we have about 50 that were non-duplicated. So great job. Some of you guys didn't think we'd get that many. So awesome. We did a great job. Congratulations to all of you. So I just shared a few. These are my own lists, and the PowerPoint slides, by the way, are going to be available to you from a link in that Google Doc as a PDF. So you're welcome to pull from any of these later. But here are some examples that might resonate particularly with teens. I mentioned earlier that my son, he had just bought himself a new iPad a while back, and we talked about whether or not he was going to get like a fancy case, or that would, offer more protection. He's like, oh, I've never dropped one, never had anything happen. And all of a sudden, like a couple of weeks later, he finds some problem on his screen, and he hadn't gotten a cover. So lesson learned. He was able to get the Apple Care placed on afterwards, and decided that was a better use of his money than having to replace the whole thing. But anyhow, accidents happen, things that you don't expect, whether it's happened to you before or not. Lots of different things can come up unexpectedly. We all know that having a vehicle can result in lots of different ones. I love that somebody mentioned, I think it was Rosanna, mentioned the replacement key fob. Yeah, those things cost a lot. If you lose that little thing, that is not like an inexpensive replacement. Other travel expenses, things like having to travel unexpectedly for things like, maybe an ill loved one, or for a funeral, having lost luggage. Somebody mentioned that. Great job. Some health examples, some of these got mentioned as well: the emergency room, the emergency dentist, the root canal, the lost glasses, maybe a new prescription that you weren't expecting, or health of your pet. I mean, anybody who has pets knows that every once in a while something happens, and you're faced with a choice and some unexpected vet bills. My lesson learned is never take your kid with you to the vet because when they tell you, well, you could spend this much, and your kid's along, it's much harder to say no. So anyhow, other examples, we mentioned a lot of these, the appliance that breaks, needing to call an emergency, after hours plumber to come and fix something, replacing things before your insurance claim comes in. A lot of times you need things before that. An unexpected increase in some type of, rent or utility bill, or an insurance policy, having a flooded basement, so many different things that can happen when we least expect it, right? And making sure that we have the ability to cover those if and when they do is certainly important, and all fall under that, umbrella of a rainy day fund, right? So some ideas. You could, for example, have students select an expense from each of those categories after you've brainstormed or given them a whole bunch of lists. They could research the actual cost, like what would the cost be if you needed a root canal, right? What would the cost be if your dog was hit by a car? Have them call a vet's office, ask them what the average is when something like that happens. What's the expense to replace the key fob on a vehicle? Those are all kinds of things that students could do some research around, share with each other, break up that list that everybody, finds one, and then talk about, well, how much then would be a smart amount to have in a healthy rainy day fund, right? Base it on actual numbers, as opposed to just pulling some figure out of the air and going with that. So just a strategy that you might use, focus specifically on the expense side again, as opposed to the income side. Here's another resource. This is 3 reasons an emergency fund is critical for teens, especially if they have a car. So there's a blog post here. Answer the questions. Do you agree or disagree with this? How much money do you think a teen should have in an emergency fund? What are other reasons that you can think of? And how could teens be encouraged to save? You could do lots of different things around this topic with your students. So before I move on, I was curious, does anybody have any strategies that they've used in their classrooms to encourage students to think about these rainy day expenses? If you do, if they have something that you've done in your classroom that's worked well, or an activity or a discussion topic, please feel free to share that in the chat. Make sure you're sending that to panelists and attendees so that we can all benefit from any ideas that might be shared. Okay, so next topic has to do with the pandemic and emergency savings. So this, again, obviously has been a hot topic. The pandemic has obviously, changed, I think, the way that we think about lots of different things in general, but definitely about emergency savings. And so I'm going to ask a poll. I'm going to put a new poll up for everybody, and ask you to, hang on, answer this question. So, do you have, so this is thinking back to, let's say, this time last year, okay? I don't know about you guys, but the last day that my kids were in a classroom was March 13th. So think back to that. Do you have more or less or about the same amount of emergency savings now as you had before the coronavirus outbreak? So do you have more in your emergency savings? Do you have less in your emergency savings? About the same? You didn't have anything in there before and you still don't have anything in there now? Or, hey, Hillary, why are you asking me this? I don't know, or I prefer not to answer, which is also a perfectly acceptable response. So, all right, so it looks like the bulk of folks that are on, so I'm seeing we've got 72% that have said about the same, and a little less than a quarter said more, and one said less. So we're going to talk about why different people ended up in different places on that, and share some information that I think would be helpful as we think through and process all of this. So everybody, I think, came to this in a very different way and ended up in a different place as well. So this survey that I'm sharing from you or for you comes from Bankrate, and this was done and asked the exact same question that I just asked all of you. And the overall rate or response had about 3 times as many Americans saying they have less emergency savings now versus more since the pandemic. So a different result than in the group that we have here. I would say this group in particular is probably particularly skewed for the most part, most educators have been able to retain their jobs. And so I would hazard a guess that most of you that are on the line are still teaching and were teaching beforehand. And so perhaps your family has not had that same level of income drop, although certainly some of you in terms of household income or maybe second jobs might also have experienced that. So I don't want to preclude that. But overall, as a whole, what we have found or what this survey found is that people with lower amounts in their emergency saving now, 35%, those with higher amounts, 13%. People who were comfortable with the amount they had in their emergency savings. So this was a follow-up question, only 16%. Households earning less than $30,000 a year were noted as feeling least comfortable with their savings situation. So individuals at the lower end of the income feeling the least comfortable with how much they had saved, which is probably not surprising. When we look at this exact question that we just talked about, the responses, came out here. So a lot of people, though, still were right about the same. Okay, and this survey took place last August. So this is what, 8 months into the pandemic, and certainly these numbers could certainly have changed since then. But you can see the breakdown here. Um, and then here's where people were in terms of how comfortable they were with it. So 16% are very comfortable, 38% somewhat comfortable, uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, don't know or refuse. So you can see that breakdown in those replies. Another thing that I thought was fascinating, so this is a survey that they have been doing for years, and in fact, the Americans with no emergency savings was 21%, which was the lowest in the 10-year history of this poll. So that to me says that people have been prompted or encouraged to start saving for emergencies where maybe they haven't before. Those that have some emergency savings, but less than 3 months worth, was 27%, the highest level in the polls 10 years. So lots of information here. I love using statistics and surveys and these kinds of things in the classroom with students. So for example, these are shared in an article on bankrate.com. You could have students take a look at this and talk about, were you surprised by the results? Why do you think some people have emergency savings now while others have less? Why do some have more? Why do some have less? How do you think the pandemic might change the way people view having an emergency fund? So, kind of interesting, ways to get students thinking about these things, and really sort of digging a little bit deeper into, really sort of the underlying motivating factors, if you will, on this topic. So let's take a look for a minute at some of what we knew going into the pandemic. So, where were Americans in general? So were they already saving pretty well to begin with? What does all of that look like? And I'm sure some of you probably have seen some of this data, but the information I want to share from you, a friend of mine has been posting about the before times, when she used to feel comfortable going to a gym and doing things. So she's referring to them as the before times, which I just think is kind of funny. She's also a physician, so she has a whole different outlook on before times as some of us. But this survey comes from, or this data comes from the before times. So this comes from the report on the economic well-being of U.S. households. And this is issued on a regular basis from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And you can see here that this data comes from 2019. So there's always a lag between when they get the information in and when it is released. But it was released in spring of 2019 after the pandemic had begun. And so what this showed was, and this is a statistic that is used a lot, is one of the questions that is asked is about the ability to be able to handle an unexpected expense of $400 is the one that's used a lot in this, or that's used frequently in this data collection. And so there's been some improvement, but it's still not good, right? So this is over time, the percent of individuals that would cover a $400 emergency expense completely using cash or its equivalent. Okay, so let's dig a little bit into the data here. So this is saying that in 2013, that 50% of people would be able to use cash or would use cash. And there's some interesting parts if you dig into this about the difference between their ability to use cash and their willingness to use it, right? So some people would rather not try and get all the way down to the very bottom of their savings account and would rather put it on a credit card, even if they know that they're going to have to make that expense up at some point. But that's sort of a whole nother issue. So anyhow, the percent you see is better, right? Like we used to say 50% of people wouldn't be able to handle a $400 expense. That number has gone down, right? It's now down to 37%. So, we look at, sort of the flip side of it. So these are the folks that can handle that with cash. This is the percent of folks that can't. And so we see that that number has been declining, which is great. It's good news. Hopefully it means that some of what we're doing, the financial education that we're providing to students and to young people that get older and to adults, it's starting to sink in. So if we just look now at 2019, this is drills down just into the most recent version of this survey. How would those individuals cover that $400 emergency expense if they weren't going to be using cash? So a good percentage, 15%, said they'd put it on a credit card and pay it off over time. Some said they would borrow it. Some would sell something. Some would use money from a bank loan or line of credit. Some would use a payday loan, direct or deposit advance, or overdraft. And then 12% said they would not be able to pay for the expense right now. So that gives you an idea of how that remaining percent, that 37% that wouldn't just use cash, how that would break down. Now, one of the things that this report on the economic well-being of U.S. households also tells us is that is information on people's ability to pay their actual monthly bills. So nearly 3 in 10 adults were either unable to pay their monthly bills or were one modest financial setback away from failing to pay monthly bills in full. So this is basically where households were at going into the pandemic. 16% of adults did not expect to pay all of their bills in the month of the survey in October 2019. And an additional 12% said that they could cover their current bills, but they would not have been able to do that if they faced that $400 unexpected expense on top of it. So this just puts into context sort of where we were as a country financially and where individuals and households were going into the pandemic. And then obviously you add those financial stressors to so many households. Some of the results are not unexpected, right? So I wanted to share with you, I'm not going to play the video, but I love these videos from 2 Cents. I encourage you, if you've never checked them out, they come from PBS, to go and explore these. This one is linked in the handout that I have provided. It is called Why You Need an Emergency Fund. So it's a little under 7 minutes. And one of the things that I like about that is they actually, and I grabbed the screen share here, 40% couldn't afford, right? So they actually grabbed that number from the survey that we just talked about, or the report on the economic well-being of households from the Federal Reserve. So that's a data point that you're going to see in lots of different places, and something that I think is helpful. And when you see that, and you see those kinds of statistics, that's one that's used over and over and over again. So you'll probably see that in a number of different places. So if you haven't, and thank you, Kevin, for sharing that link. For those that missed it the first time, you can grab it now and review those at your leisure. So let's take a look at savings rates, and I'm going to share with you a different resource this time, or a couple of different resources actually. But one of the things that we look at is the rate of personal savings. So this is how much as a percent families are saving on an ongoing basis, and this is information that's been collected for decades. And I wanted to kick it off by sharing one of Next Gen Personal Finance's, what they call questions of the day. So in the handout, you're going to find a link to this unit in the curriculum from Next Gen Personal Finance. If you scroll down and go over on the right, you'll find questions of the day, which you can click on View More, and it'll expand it so that you can see all the ones that they have on savings. If you've never used these questions of the day, they're fantastic, and they have them on lots of different topics throughout their curriculum. This one was last updated in August of last year, and these are done on an ongoing basis. So take a look at these. But this one is, what is the personal savings rate in the United States? Personal saving as a percentage of disposable personal income, or DPI, frequently frequently referred to as the personal savings rate, is calculated as the ratio of personal saving to disposable personal income. All right, and this comes from the Federal Reserve. So you can have students, guess what that is. You can have them put it in you can say, hey, do you think it's, less than 10%, between, 11 and 20%? You can kind of go through and use this in a variety of different ways. The slides that they provide are already pre-done. So this one comes and shows this data from Fred, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And at the time that this was done, it was 19%. And then one of the things I love is they give you these questions. So how does the personal savings rate today, about 19%, compare to the rate during other periods of time? In our current historical moment, what would be your explanation of a 19% personal savings rate? What has been the general trend during recessions? What do you think is a good savings target to aim for personally as a percentage of disposable personal income? So I want to share with you the source of this data. So the Federal Reserve's economic data, or FRED, as it is lovingly referred to, has data and information on so many different things that we could do an entire series of webinars just on what you can do with FRED. But if you've never explored it, I encourage you to go in. I've given you a link to this data source in particular. You'll notice, for example, so one of those questions was about recessions. Well, how in the heck am I supposed to know when there's a recession, right? If you're a student and have no idea when I'm looking at this, right? Well, each of these gray shaded areas, you'll see, notice down here, recessions are shaded with the most recent end date is undecided in some cases. So that's over here. So each of these gray shaded areas is a point when our economy was considered to be in a recession. So one of the things I love about this is that, oops, excuse me, where that came from. Oh, I hope really, that's why. So you can click on download, and you can get this entire data. So you can download the entire data in an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file. I love being able to pull this in as an image. You can also download it as a PowerPoint or as a PDF of the graph. So you can export the data or the graph in more than one way. And I just find that to be a beautiful thing. Some of you know that I came into personal finance as a former math teacher, and the math of all this just makes me happy. And the idea of being able to do all sorts of things with this data just, okay, I'm a dork. All right. So anyhow, that said, here are a couple of images that I grabbed. This is the other thing I should point out is that you can change the range. So you can do 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, or max. And so here we're looking at the maximum. So this starts around 1960 when this information has been collected up until today. And if you look at this, I don't know what you guys notice, but I see, oh, look, it used to be a little higher back in the 1960s and 70s. Wow, it got up to, look, that's almost like 17%. Now, if I was in the live version, if I clicked here, it would tell me the exact percent in around 1975. And then, we took a pretty big dip, and then it went up a little bit, and then it's gone down, 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 down. And looks like, oh, all right, or okay, around 2005. Okay, it started increasing. All right, let's see. When then we went up, and then we went really down again. Wonder what was happening during that period of time. By the way, this period was the foreclosure and housing crisis, right? So you see that things are going kind of crazy, and then you're like, whoa, what happened over here? Look at this spike way over here to the right. Boy, I wish I could get more information about that. So let's drill down. This is 10 years. So this just looks at the last 10 years. And again, you can do this in any way. Now, I always like looking at graphs and how graphs can be manipulated in particular. Like if we look at that long span, or like kind of like drilling down on the stock market, if you only looked at one part where it was like, in one day. You think, oh, it's crazy. You never could figure out what the trend is, right? So talk about trends and what have you. But then really digging down and saying, what was going on right here, right? So all of a sudden in 2020, people started saving more money. All right. Why do you think that was? Why would people start going way up high, right? So then we look at, okay, well, let's drill this down even closer, right? So we look at February, March. Whoa, everybody's at home, right? So great conversation to have with your students. Why do you think that the savings rate went from, let's just say, 8 or 9% in February to almost 35% in April? And one thing you could talk about is, what was the change for people? What was the change for individuals in terms of their outlook on things? Were they spending less? Did they receive a stimulus check? Were they changing their lifestyle? Did they all of a sudden have this aha moment and say, oh, wow, maybe instead of doing this, I should put money towards savings instead, because now all of a sudden I realize it's important, right? So the answer is going to be different for everybody, but talk about a great opportunity to get students to start hypothesizing and looking at data, especially right now, because these kids lived it, right? They know what has happened. They saw what was happening. They remember what it was like when all of a sudden you couldn't go to any restaurant, you couldn't go out to the movies, it was hard to buy anything, you couldn't go out and go to BJ's or Costco or Sam's Club and spend $100 on toilet paper because it wasn't there, right? But maybe you wanted to go and spend a lot because you wanted to hoard up on stuff. Who knows, right? And then why did it start to slowly shift, right? And then why did it go back up again? So again, this is, so fascinating to me to dig into this, to hypothesize, to think about it, to have these conversations that can be really powerful and, get kids thinking. And then like that question from NGPF earlier was sort of that notion of, well, what do you think? How much do you think you should save, right? Like, what's the right percentage of disposable income to be putting into savings? And we're going to get to that a little bit more in a minute. So this is another example of an NGPF question of the day. So this came from January of this year. They've got a new look and feel of these. I think these are pretty. But anyhow, how many Americans could not pay a surprise $1,000 bill using their savings account? So this is there's sort of two aspects. One is, how much money is in their savings account, right? So here's an additional data source. There's another Bankrate survey that came out in December with some results, and again, some additional follow-up questions. So I'd encourage you to join in the fun of using this data, using these current events. NGPF, if you subscribe to them, they push these kinds of things out, or you can just go and look and see if there's stuff that you might want to see. In some cases, like that savings rate, maybe the information isn't completely current, but you now know how to go and get it yourself, right? Because you can go to Fred, you can download that, you can have students go onto the website and interact with it themselves. There's lots of different things that you can do. Okay, so we're going to take a step back from data and take a look at how much to save. And I think this is an interesting one because the answer is all over the place. And I know all of us have some different maybe go-to people that we think of in terms of sources, like, where I would go for good financial advice. I've got a bookshelf full of books on financial topics. Some of them range incredibly. So I'm just going to share with you 3 different experts and what they say about saving. So Dave Ramsey in his sort of baby steps program says, first of all, get so that you have $1,000. All right. And then work up to having 3 to 6 months of expense. So lots of us have feelings about Dave Ramsey. I'm sure some people here love them, and some people probably, avoid some of his advice, particularly around debt. But this is where Dave Ramsey, and I know a lot of folks use the Dave Ramsey curriculum in their schools. This is where Dave Ramsey lands on the topic. Erin Lowry, some of you, if you've ever read the book Broke Millennial, may be familiar with her. So her answer is a little different. And she says, at least 1 month of expenses, right? So she's sort of saying, to start from that point and then build up. So, but not the $1,000. She's saying, aim for that 1 month of expenses. And then sort of at the other end, and kind of the higher range of recommendations, Susie Orman says you should be aiming for 8 months worth of expenses. So obviously, when we're doing this, we have to know what our expenses are, right? So this is, again, on that loss of income side as opposed to the expense side. To know, okay, how long might you be out of a job, right? And so I found this comment, saving 3 to 6 months worth of cash to cover expenses was not enough for a pandemic that is stretched to 1 year and counting, right? Individuals who thought, hey, we were doing a great job. We have been saving for, something like this. And, a lot of those folks had been following the advice, right, for so long. They've been doing exactly what people have been preaching. They've got, 3 to 6 months of expenses, and now they've been out of work for, a lot longer. They lost their job and they haven't been able to find a new job. And so I think that we're going to see some shifts in the way that, if I had my crystal ball and I could look into it, I'd probably say that, maybe we're going to start seeing people rethink this importance of savings, and, really think about what it is that they want to do in terms of making sure that they're prepared in case something like this happens again. And so just something to kind of think about. There are some online calculators, and I have some sort of mixed feelings about these, in particular with using them with teens, because they all focus on those figuring out what your expenses are on a month-to-month basis. And teens' expenses are negligible for the most part. So when students get older, or if you're having students do a budget based on a particular career or the lifestyle that they are hoping to live, that's where I would connect this. I would not have students use an online calculator to sort of figure this out without having done their due diligence and figuring out their budget first. I really feel like that's a prerequisite for being able to use these, but I do link to these 3 online calculators in the handout. So in the time that we have left, I want to talk about some strategies for savings that I think you can use to promote the notion of savings. Or I saw Trish mentioned this whole idea of, pay yourself first, right? So some saving strategies that can be used that are really good, especially for young people. In particular, the first one is automating your savings, right? So and this is another graphic from America Saves. They have these in a lot of different formats, so you could download them and maybe even print them if you want some like posters around your classroom. These are some things that you might want to think about, just some ideas. So here's a couple of ideas for how you can automate. Every payday, your bank or credit union transfers a fixed amount from your checking account to a savings or investment account. Talk to your local bank or credit union to set this up, right? Choose a day of the month or a regular interval, such as every 2 weeks, to transfer a set amount from your checking account to a savings vehicle. All right. This is advice that I think can come in incredibly helpful. A lot of people are willing and able to think about setting up direct payments for things like Spotify or Netflix or all of these different, kinds of automated expenses. And yet they don't ever put that same automation principle to use for savings. And really, it's the same kind of thing, right? Pay yourself first. Put those expenses ahead of the other ones, in particular, the ones that aren't needs, that are just wants, and make it automatic so that it's being done, put into an account where you're not going to think about it. And really takes that thought process out. Splitting your savings is another great way to do this. And so there's a couple of different ways to do it. In particular, if your employer will allow you to take your direct deposit and split it oftentimes like a percentage amount, but put some of it into a savings account and some of it into a checking account. Some people do this already if they have like a high deductible health insurance plan. So you may already be putting a certain amount every pay cycle through direct deposit into an HSA, a health savings account. Think about that differently and some different ways that you can do that as well. Um, Also, like I mentioned before, you can also do this sort of, from that notion of as soon as you get that money in, to have your financial institution then split where that goes off to. Even small amounts, and I think this is helpful, an example to show to students. So individuals who are paid weekly, all right, if you put $10 into your savings at the end of the year into a savings account, you'd have $520. If you were to put $30 in and you're paid biweekly, that would total up to $780 or $50. You can see the difference that this makes. So this is just a nice, I think, way of getting folks to think about, by pay period, what that might look like. Yes, Trish, I'm glad that you mentioned it because you're like reading my mind, right? There are a ton of savings apps and programs out there that can help automate this for individuals. These are all linked in your handout, as well as this classroom activity from Pathway to Financial Success, which is from Discover and Discovery Education. And in this classroom activity, it's called Savings Made Easy under the topic of finding money to save. And it has students basically, this is a premise or the setup for it. You have students go to different places in a room based on how much money they'd put into savings if they were to win $300 as a contest. And get sort of students thinking about it and this whole notion of having a savings goal. But then the meat and potatoes of this is that they divide up into groups or can do this individually, where they take one of these apps and they can choose a different one, but any of these apps or programs, and they look at it and say, how does it work? What services does the app provide? Who could benefit from using it? Are there any fees to using the app, sign up and or ongoing? If so, what are they? What do you need to do to use the app? Is the service associated with a specific bank or credit union, or can you use your own? This is a particularly important one. Does the app seem like it would be easy to use? Are there reviews? Are they positive or negative? Would you use it? Why or why not? What's one thing that you think that could be done to improve it? So a great opportunity for students to really, dig in. Yes, the one downside is in some cases you can't like download the app and get into it much without actually connecting it, so you don't necessarily want students to do that, but they can find out most, if not all, of the answers to this by doing some research and also reading different reviews of some of these online. So speaking of that, this is a great opportunity to teach students to become good digital consumers. So when you're shopping around for an app that you're going to use for something like this, there's lots of different places that you can go. I searched for saving app reviews and I got 674 million in 0.54 seconds. So there's no shortage of reviews. But I would encourage them to look at different places and what do they include. So like this one from Bankrate breaks it down by different sort of categories, right? So this one's best for novice investors. This one's the best one for the price that you pay. This long game, which is relatively new, is a great game-like experience. Credit Karma is great because it gives you, pros and cons of each one. So when you're looking at online reviews, do they have any vested interest in this? Do they get money if you sign up for one of these? Who's doing the review? How current is it? Is there one overall winner, or do they have different categories? So some things that you can get to have students, really becoming good digital consumers. Then we get into this notion of where do you save this money? In particular, some questions that you can ask of your financial institutions. So, can you have more than one savings account? Can you name them? Is that going to impact how much money you need to have in your account at any one given time? Are there fees? I personally love naming different accounts, and some of that actually can also be done in some of those apps, which is pretty cool. So you can kind of like have different buckets for different things. And then, looking at what's important to you when you think about things. Do you want something that's, going to have a higher interest rate for these kinds of savings? Do you want to make it really hard to spend? Some people advocate for putting your emergency savings into a financial institution where you don't think about using that money. Like you don't have a checking account associated with it, so you don't have a debit card, so it's a lot harder to spend. These are all different kinds of things that you can think about and have students examine. There's another lesson that I've linked for you from Practical Money Skills for Life, which comes from Visa. It has some thoughts on where to stash your cash. So everything from CDs, savings accounts, money market accounts, retirement accounts, 529 plans, mutual funds, stocks, and bonds. And then they also provide some details about these, like what it is, what's the risk, pros and cons, as well as then some scenarios that students take a look at and decide what to do based on research that they've done about some very specific financial institutions and what is offered at each of those. So it's a great resource. Again, wanted to give you guys lots of different options here. One other resources that I want to mention, this is another video. This comes from Better Money Habits, which is brought to you by Bank of America. They partnered as well with the Council on Economic Education and Econ EdLink to provide some resources attached to some of their videos. So this is a handout that students can do in conjunction with the video. So in particular, there's some things that students would only be able to fill out really if they had watched the video. And again, I have linked to that. All right. I think I have pretty much managed for the most part to be able to get through everything. So I would love it if you would share over in the comments how you might be able to use these ideas and strategies. Also, great link. I love it. Thank you, Fred, for sharing that one. Creating a savings first aid kit. Yes, I believe if that's the one I'm thinking about. There's one that's the student one. There's also a financial first aid kit from Operation Hope that's been around for a long time. That's fantastic. If you haven't seen that one, that's another one that's a great resource. Maybe I'll add that also into the handouts as well. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I am glad that we had the time to talk about emergency savings and sort of some insights that we've come up with over the past year or so, as well as strategies that we can use in our classrooms to teach this. So thank you so very, very much.